I sense something. You are not something I can feel.
What if history's greatest assassin stepped into the heart of the Death Star's shadow? Forget everything you know about the Jedi and the Sith. Ezio Auditore just arrived on Coruscant, and he's not here for a lightsaber duel. He's here to dismantle the entire Empire from the inside out, and he's doing it in a way the Force literally cannot see. This is the deadliest crossover I've ever analyzed. And trust me, the Emperor is about to realize he's not the only one playing the long game. Let's see if the Creed survives a galaxy far, far away. The Piece of Eden did not ask permission. It had never asked permission. Not from the civilizations that built it, not from the hands that carried it across centuries of war and faith and desperate purpose, not from the last man to hold it in a tower in Masyaf, with the specific understanding that some truths were too large for a single lifetime to fully contain. It operated according to principles that predated every institution that had ever tried to claim authority over it. And when it found a vergence, a knot in the fabric of whatever connected consciousness to reality across the universe's various expressions, it responded the way it had always responded. It opened a door. Ezio Auditore da Firenze fell through that door at a height of approximately 40 meters above a surface that was not cobblestone, not earth, not any material his body had previously encountered, and hit a structural platform belonging to Coruscant's 843rd level, with the specific controlled catastrophe of a man who had spent his entire adult life falling off things professionally. He rolled, assessed, came up in a crouch with the hidden blade extended and the immediate 3-meter radius cleared by visual sweep before his breathing had time to stabilize. Nothing moved. The space around him was wrong. Not wrong in a way that required extensive analysis. Wrong in the specific immediate way that a place was wrong when every sensory input contradicted every expectation. The air carried chemicals he didn't recognize. The light came from sources that emitted without fire. The sounds were mechanical in a register that no mechanism he'd encountered produced. Distant, layered, the specific acoustic signature of a city so large that its noise had developed its own ecology. He stood. He looked up, which was something he did automatically in new environments, because up was where threats came from when you were in cities, and what he saw above him was more city, towers ascending into a haze that was not weather, but was the accumulated output of a civilization that had been burning something for longer than he had language to estimate. And beyond the towers, barely visible through the haze, the specific dark clarity of space. No sky, no horizon, just city, ascending until it became the void. He had been in strange places before. The apple had shown him things that defied the categories his education had provided. He had walked through ancient ruins that predated Rome, had touched artifacts whose function no living person could fully explain, had conducted his life in the space between what people believed was true and what actually was. He filed the wrongness under wrong, significant and requiring investigation, rather than crisis. Because crisis was a state that impaired function, and function was currently the priority. The Piece of Eden was in his hand. It was doing something it had not done before, not the pulsing of active use, not the cold silence of dormancy, but something between. A sustained low resonance that he felt through his palm rather than heard, as if the artifact were running, maintaining some ongoing operation that it hadn't previously needed to maintain. He had no way of knowing, in this first minute on Coruscant's 843rd level, that the operation it was maintaining was the thing that would define his entire time in this galaxy. He only knew that it felt like camouflage. The wrongness that moved through the Force at 0347 Coruscant Standard Time was described, in the briefing that reached the Jedi Council by 0600, in terms that none of the reporting masters found adequate. Absence, said Master Plo Koon, who had been in meditation when the disturbance occurred and whose particular Force sensitivity gave his description specific credibility. Not the absence of the dark side. We know what that feels like. The specific quality of a place where someone has deliberately suppressed their presence. This was different. A place where the Force extended towards something and found. He paused, searching for a word that existed in his vocabulary for this concept and didn't. Found less than it expected. Something the Force cannot read, said Mace Windu. Something the Force cannot find, Plo Koon corrected. The distinction matters. A thing the Force cannot read might simply be shielded, hidden through deliberate technique. A thing the Force cannot find is absent from it, as if it exists in a space adjacent to where the Force reaches. Yoda, who had been quiet through the briefing with the specific quality of quietness that signified active processing rather than absence of opinion, said, "Adjacent. Yes, in the Force, a shape there is not of darkness, not of light, of nothing, like a word with no sound." "Is that possible?" asked a junior council member whose name Windu had been making an effort to use more consistently. "Possible. Anything is," Yoda said. "Known to us before, this specific thing was not." The assignment went to Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Because the lower city's geography and population density required investigators who could move through it, with a combination of force sensitivity and combat capability that the Council couldn't spare more senior resources for, given the state of the war, and because Obi-Wan's specific methodical approach to investigation made him the correct tool for a problem that was defined entirely by what wasn't there rather than what was. Anakin received the assignment with the specific quality he received everything during this period. A surface compliance stretched thin over a distraction that had nothing to do with the current assignment. His mind was somewhere else, as it frequently was, in the space where fear of loss had taken up permanent residence. "We're looking for an absence," Obi-Wan said, in the transport, reviewing the briefing data with the focused attention he brought to problems that required actual thought rather than combat. "How do you find something that isn't there?" Anakin said. "You look for where it should be and find the gap instead," Obi-Wan said. "The same principle as finding a forgery. You look for what's wrong about the context rather than trying to find the false thing directly." Anakin looked at him. "That actually makes sense," he said, with the specific surprise he sometimes expressed when Obi-Wan's explanations landed cleanly. "I have my moments," Obi-Wan said. Ezio had been in Coruscant for 6 hours when he identified the first useful pattern. 6 hours was fast, but not unprecedented. He had learned to read cities the way other people read texts, not all at once, but in scanning passes that extracted the structural information before descending into detail. Every city had an architecture of power that expressed itself in physical geography. Who built tall? Who built hidden? Where the money moved and where it tried to look like it wasn't moving. This city's architecture of power was the most sophisticated he had ever encountered, which he meant as a neutral observation rather than a criticism. Sophisticated systems were not inherently unjust, but sophisticated systems used to concentrate power invisibly were, in his experience, always worth examining. The systems here were sophisticated, and something at their center was being deliberately obscured. He had been moving through the lower levels with the ease of long practice, not arrogantly, not with the specific overconfidence that killed assassins who underestimated new environments, but with the earned confidence of someone who understood that city geometry was city geometry, and that people who wanted to move through cities without being noticed shared certain universal behaviors regardless of the century or civilization. He kept to the transitions, the spaces between spaces, the maintenance corridors, the loading platforms, the underbelly infrastructure that every city required to function, and that everyone who didn't work in it treated as invisible. In Firenze, these spaces had belonged to servants and tradespeople and the guild's own network of unacknowledged pathways. Here they belonged to workers whose clothing and tools and specific quality of not looking at anything communicated that they'd learned the city's invisible population's first survival rule: be uninteresting. He was very good at being uninteresting. The political architecture resolved itself in pieces. There was a Senate, a governing body, vast, housed in a building of such deliberate grandeur that the grandiosity itself was a message about the nature of the power it was supposed to represent. There was a war, ongoing, whose specific character he was still assembling from fragments of overheard conversation and the evidence written in the city's logistics patterns. The supply movements, the military presence, the specific economic texture of a population living adjacent to large-scale sustained conflict. And there was a man. He hadn't identified the man yet. He had only identified the shape the man's influence left. The way that a sculptor left the shape of their hand in clay, not as a signature, but as the inevitable consequence of touch. Someone was organizing things. Not visibly. Visibly, there were generals and politicians and the administrative apparatus of a governing system. But beneath the visible organization, there were patterns of timing, of resource flow, of crisis emergence and resolution that didn't fit the visible organizing structure. Someone was turning wheels that the official machinery wasn't supposed to know were turning. This was familiar territory. He had spent his life in this territory. He found the maintenance shaft that provided access to the Senate District's outer perimeter at hour 7, after 2 hours of careful study of the infrastructure maps he'd extracted from a maintenance terminal using the Apple's interface capability. The Apple connected to things here in ways he hadn't expected. The technology was different from anything in his world, but whatever the artifact used to interface with information systems seemed to operate on principles universal enough to translate. The Senate District at night had the specific quality of powerful places when their occupants were absent. The architecture's intention exposed without the human performance that normally filled it. The grandeur sitting in the dark, being itself without audience. He watched from a maintenance shaft with a view line that covered the primary approach to a building his research had identified as significant. He was still watching when a figure emerged from the building at 0200, in a ground car that had the specific profile of something that didn't want to be noticed, but had been built for someone important enough that complete inconspicuousness was not achievable. He couldn't see the occupant. He noted the building, the vehicle, the time, the route. He filed it under, returned to this core, and moved to the next observation point. He had been in new cities before. The first day was always intelligence. The targets revealed themselves to patience, faster than to pursuit. He ran into Anakin Skywalker on his 9th hour in Coruscant, in a market corridor on level 820, where the population density was high enough that moving without contact required either careful path planning or force-assisted navigation, and Ezio had only one of those available. The contact was brief, a shoulder pass in a crowd, the specific geography of two people occupying the same space for half a second before the crowd's flow separated them. He knew the man was significant before he understood why. The Piece of Eden's probability reading was not identical to sight or intuition. It was closer to the way chess felt when he was playing well. The board's future states visible several moves ahead, not because he could see the future, but because he understood the pattern well enough to extrapolate it. The Apple enhanced this, made it specific and immediate, rather than the product of deliberate analysis. The young man he'd passed in the market had a probability field that was loud. Too much potential, too many converging vectors, too much of what felt like genuine significance pressing against the moment. Ezio turned after the man had passed, watching his back, the specific posture of someone wound tight around something they were carrying, a grief or a fear that hadn't found resolution. Dangerous, his read of the probability field said, not to me, to everything around him. Whatever this man decides in the coming period will matter enormously, and he hasn't decided yet. He filed the young man under observe, but do not engage, and moved on. 2 minutes later, the specific warmth-adjacent sensation of someone examining the space he'd just occupied reached him through whatever the Apple was doing to his perception. He didn't turn. He took the next left, moved into a commercial corridor, and let the crowd absorb him with the ease of long practice. Behind him, he heard a voice, calm, measured, carrying the specific quality of someone who was actually quite alarmed, but had been doing this long enough that alarm presented as methodical. He was here, the voice said, to someone else, not to him. 15 seconds ago, I can feel the gap he left. Ezio kept walking. In the city of Firenze, he had once spent 4 months invisible to an organization that was actively hunting him. He had learned, in those 4 months, that the most effective camouflage was not disguise, but behavior. Look like what the environment expected to see. Move like what the environment expected to move. Be, as completely as possible, part of the texture of the place rather than a figure against it. The market corridor absorbed him. Behind him, in the space he'd vacated, a Jedi and his former Padawan stood in a crowd of ordinary people and felt the specific shape of nothing where something had been. "What is that?" Anakin said, and his voice carried genuine unease beneath the professional tone. "I don't know," Obi-Wan said, which was honest and therefore more alarming than any specific wrong answer would have been. 3 weeks was enough time to understand a city's corruption. Not to map it completely. Complete maps of corruption were the project of lifetimes. And even then, corruption had the specific evolutionary property of developing new expressions faster than any static map could accommodate. But 3 weeks of systematic assassin methodology produced something more useful than a complete map, a model. The internal logic that generated the specific corruption Ezio was observing, which was more valuable than any catalog of its individual expressions because it allowed him to extrapolate toward what wasn't yet visible. The model resolved around a single principle. Everything serves the war. Not in the sense of military necessity, that was the visible layer, the official justification, the explanation that citizens and senators and military commanders all found plausible because it was partially true. Wars required supply chains. Wars required political management. Wars required the specific maintenance of institutional will that kept populations funding and supporting conflict they hadn't chosen, with the comprehensiveness that strategic victory required. But underneath that true layer was a layer that was more specifically true. The war had been constructed to produce certain outcomes that had nothing to do with military victory. The specific battles that had occurred, the specific political pressures that had been applied at the specific moments they'd been applied, the specific crises that had emerged with the specific timing required to justify specific emergency powers, these things were not the products of two sides in genuine conflict. They were the products of something that had interests in both sides. He had seen this pattern before. In Italy. In the decades of his life spent uncovering the Templar Order's long architecture of hidden control, the invisible hand that moved through the visible institutions of church and state to produce outcomes that no single visible actor should have been able to produce. The scale here was different. The galaxy was larger than Italy, by measures that strained his capacity to fully conceptualize. But the method was the same method that powerful men had always used when they wanted to control things too large to control through direct force. Make the control invisible, distribute its expression through systems that appeared independent, and ensure that the people within those systems served the architecture without understanding they were serving an architecture. He had spent 3 weeks following the money, the timing, the appointments, and the specific series of coincidences that stopped being coincidences when you had enough of them. They led to one address. The building he'd observed on his first night, the one the ground car without visible importance had departed from at 0200, was the Supreme Chancellor's private office complex. He had learned what a Supreme Chancellor was. He had learned what the Republic was, what the Senate was, what the Clone Wars were. He had conducted this education through observation and inference, and the systematic extraction of publicly available information through terminals that the Apple could interface with, supplemented by conversations he'd had in his cover identity, a maintenance contractor whose credentials the Apple had generated with the same efficient thoroughness it brought to everything he asked of it. The learning had taken time he hadn't wasted. Because understanding a system was the prerequisite for understanding who was breaking it. Palpatine. The name attached to the pattern 3 weeks in, during an investigation session in which he had laid every piece of evidence he'd accumulated across the floor of a rented storage unit and looked at the network diagram they collectively produced, following every line to its source with the patience that this specific methodology required, and that produced clarity only if you followed it all the way to the end without substituting inference for evidence prematurely. Every line led to Palpatine. Not directly. Nothing in a system this sophisticated led to its center directly. Direct lines were what visible actors had. and the center of this system was precisely not a visible actor in the relevant sense. The lines led through intermediaries, through timing correlations, through the specific pattern of what decisions benefited this one figure's accumulation of formal authority while appearing to be responses to crises he was managing rather than crises he'd manufactured. Ezio had seen this pattern before, expressed in the specific grammar of 15th century Italian politics. He was looking at it again, expressed in the grammar of a galactic republic at war. He sat with the model for 2 days before accepting it, because acceptance of this conclusion meant commitment to an action, and the specific seriousness of the action required the specific seriousness of certainty. On the 3rd day, he accepted it. Then, he began planning. His encounter with Obi-Wan Kenobi happened on the 14th day, in a cantina in the Senate district that he had selected as a regular observation point, because its clientele included a consistent population of low-level Senate staff, whose conversations were an excellent source of institutional intelligence. He hadn't expected to share a table with a Jedi. In retrospect, the probability indicators he'd been reading had given him sufficient warning. There was a quality to how the cantina's population moved that suggested the presence of someone significant. The specific subtle reorganization of space that happened when a person who commanded attention entered an environment. He had read it as a politician or a senior military officer, which was the category his model was calibrated for, and had failed to account for the 3rd category he was only beginning to understand existed. Obi-Wan sat down across from him with the specific quality of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had decided that the direct approach would be more productive than the indirect one. "You're not Senate staff," Obi-Wan said. His basic was clear, his tone conversational, his posture completely relaxed in the specific way that people who had developed the capacity to be genuinely dangerous in a moment's notice were relaxed when they'd decided not to be dangerous yet. "You're wearing the credential chip of a maintenance contractor from the Outer Rim, but your posture is wrong for someone who's spent significant time in confined maintenance corridors. And you've been in this cantina before, 4 times in the past 2 weeks, at irregular intervals, always in a position with sightlines to both exits and the Senate district entrance." Ezio looked at him.
You've been watching me. I've been watching the gap you leave in the space. You are the most consistently absent presence I've encountered in 20 years of practice. Explain.
He studied Ezio with the specific focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they hadn't expected to encounter. "You're not a Force user. You're not suppressing your presence through training. You're simply not there. In a way, I don't have adequate category for." "And your response to things you don't have category for?" Ezio asked. "To ask questions," Obi-Wan said. "Usually." He paused. "You're human. Whatever you're doing in this city, it involves systematic observation of the Senate district. You're not separatist. Your equipment and method don't fit any separatist profile we have." He folded his hands on the table. "So, what are you doing here?" Ezio looked at him for a long moment. This man was, his probability reading said, genuinely uncorrupted. The specific quality of institutional faith that had been hollowed out in every corrupted person he'd ever investigated was intact in this one. Not naive, not without awareness of institutional failure, but genuinely committed in a way that produced a quality of presence that Ezio had learned to recognize as rare and therefore meaningful. "Investigating," Ezio said. "Who?" Obi-Wan said. "I'm not certain of the name yet," Ezio said carefully. "I have a pattern. I'm pursuing the pattern to its source." "What kind of pattern?" "The kind where one person benefits from every crisis they appear to be managing," Ezio said. "Where the timing of catastrophes aligns too precisely with the accumulation of formal authority. Where the war serves interests that have nothing to do with the war's stated objectives." Obi-Wan was very still. "That's a significant accusation," he said. "It's an observation," Ezio corrected. "Accusations require certainty. I'm building towards certainty." "Against who?" Obi-Wan asked. Ezio considered him. "I think you already know," Ezio said. "Or you suspect. You've been close enough to this pattern to feel its edges, and you're too intelligent not to have noticed that the edges form a shape." Obi-Wan was quiet for a long moment. "The Jedi Order has concerns," he said carefully, about the concentration of executive authority in the current administration. These concerns are, he paused, choosing words with evident care, disputed within the order. There are those who believe the Chancellor is a genuine ally, operating under extraordinary circumstances. And there are those who believe the circumstances may not be as extraordinary as they appear. Which do you believe? Ezio asked. Obi-Wan looked at him with the specific expression of a man giving a question more consideration than the social context required. I believe, he said finally, that the wisest response to that question, from a stranger I cannot read through the Force and who is conducting an unaffiliated investigation in the Senate District, is not to answer it directly. That is a wise response, Ezio agreed. Who are you? Obi-Wan asked. Someone who has spent his life finding the people who operate the architecture of hidden power, Ezio said, and removing them. Obi-Wan studied him. Removing them, he said. Yes. The word sat between them with its full weight. I would ask you, Obi-Wan said carefully, to refrain from taking any action while the Jedi Order's own investigation is ongoing. How long has the Jedi Order's investigation been ongoing? Ezio asked. A pause. Years, Obi-Wan said. And its progress? Another pause. Longer. I would still ask you to wait, Obi-Wan said. I respect that you're asking, Ezio said. I won't promise what I can't promise. He stood, left payment for his drink, and moved toward the exit with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had decided the conversation was complete. The gap you leave, Obi-Wan said, behind him, in the Force. How is that possible? Ezio paused without turning. Perhaps, he said, the Force was not designed to see everything. He left. At the cantina's exit, he felt the warm adjacent sensation of that probability assessment again. Obi-Wan reaching through whatever mechanism he used to sense the world around him, finding Ezio's location, finding nothing. He was outside and 3 levels down before the sensation faded. Anakin found him on day 19. Not deliberately. The probability field that surrounded Anakin continued to be the most chaotic Ezio had observed in 3 weeks of reading this galaxy's inhabitants. And what the probability indicators said about this man remained consistent. Too much potential, too many converging vectors, decisions not yet made that would matter enormously. They occupied the same maintenance corridor on the Senate District's lower level for 47 seconds, before Anakin registered the anomaly in the Force and turned. You, Anakin said. Not recognition exactly. Ezio had made no impression the first time, had been absorbed into the market crowd without remainder. But something more immediate. The specific quality of a young man whose instincts were faster than his reasoning, identifying something that required attention. Maintenance, Ezio said, gesturing to the toolkit the Apple had provisioned him with. You're not maintenance, Anakin said, and his voice had the specific flat certainty of someone who hadn't worked this out but felt it. Obi-Wan described a gap. You're the gap. Ezio assessed him. Up close, the probability field was even louder than the market pass had suggested. And beneath the noise of it, the specific emotional architecture that his long practice at reading people produced. Grief, fear, love rendered complicated by fear of its loss. The specific strain of someone who was carrying something they'd been told not to carry, and was carrying it anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. What are you carrying? Ezio asked, before the strategic part of his consciousness could override the instinctive human response to recognizing that a person was in pain. Anakin stared at him. What? He said. You're in pain, Ezio said. Not physical, the kind that comes from loving something you're afraid of losing. I've carried the same weight. He paused. It makes people vulnerable to people who offer solutions. Anakin's expression did something complicated. You don't know anything about me, he said. No, Ezio agreed. But I know what that weight looks like from the outside. I wore it for years. He met the young man's eyes with the specific directness he used when he had decided honesty was more useful than strategy. Be careful who offers to lift it for you. The people who offer to lift that specific weight almost always want something in exchange that costs more than the relief is worth. Anakin stared at him. Who are you? He said. Someone passing through, Ezio said. On my way to finish something. He moved past Anakin toward the corridor's far end, and felt the probability field's specific quality as he passed. The future states pressing against the present. Too many of them. Too much depending on too few decisions still unmade. He did not look back. Behind him, Anakin stood in the corridor and felt the gap that Ezio left in the Force, and thought, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, about a conversation he'd been avoiding having with himself for months. Palpatine felt the wrongness on the 22nd day. Not immediately. The specific quality of the wrongness was such that it had been accumulating in his peripheral awareness for several weeks before it crossed the threshold of conscious attention, manifesting as a series of micro-anomalies that his Force sensitivity registered and his analytical consciousness filed, without immediately flagging as connected. A surveillance report that described activity in a corridor 3 seconds before the surveillance system registered it. The officer who'd written the report had been embarrassed by the apparent malfunction and had buried the discrepancy at the bottom of a footnote. A source who had been reliably reporting the movements of a person of interest had, twice in the past week, reported the person of interest departing a location shortly before Palpatine's own intelligence apparatus arrived. Not enough to be suspicious individually, but producing in the aggregate a pattern of slight mistiming that precision operations did not normally exhibit. And in the Force, when he extended his perception toward the Senate district's surrounding geography in the specific manner he used to monitor the ambient, emotional, and psychic texture of environments where his interests were concentrated. A gap. Not a dark side presence. Not a Jedi's suppressed signature. Not any of the categories of Force-relevant phenomenon his 10,000 years of Sith training had given him taxonomy for. Simply less where there should have been more. He sat with this, alone in his private office, with the specific quality of focus he brought to problems that refused to resolve into familiar shapes. He had survived, through the dark side's prescience and his own intellectual superiority, combined with the specific patience of someone who had been playing a game designed to last decades, every threat that the galaxy's existing power structures had been capable of producing. The nature of his advantage was exactly this: he could see further. The Force gave him knowledge of approaching threats before those threats could act, giving him time to prepare, redirect, and manage. In 50 years of active operation, not one significant threat had arrived without warning. This thing was not in the Force. Therefore, by definition, it was not in his warning system. The specific quality of what he felt in that private office, for the first time in 50 years, was something he would have recognized immediately in anyone else, would have exploited immediately in anyone else, because it was the specific vulnerability he most reliably weaponized in the beings around him. Fear. He processed it for approximately 8 seconds, then filed it under a category he rarely used: information about a genuine variable, rather than the more usual categories of manageable threat or irrelevant factor. The distinction was significant. Genuine variables required different responses than manageable threats, not suppression and control, but understanding before any other action. He reached through the Force again, extending perception with the full focused capability of a Sith Lord at the height of his power, toward the specific geography where the gap was most pronounced. Nothing. Whatever was there, the Force did not reach it. His mind, which was extraordinary by any measure and had been trained by a millennium of Sith tradition to operate optimally under pressure, produced the following analysis in the time it took to exhale. Something exists in this city that the Force cannot perceive. This thing has been operating for at minimum 3 weeks, based on the pattern of micro-anomalies. Its operations are concentrated in and around the Senate district. It moves with sufficient skill to avoid conventional surveillance. It does not appear to be affiliated with any existing power structure, because no existing power structure operates through assets the Force cannot detect. Therefore, whatever this is, it comes from somewhere outside existing structures. Therefore, it has an objective I have not anticipated. Therefore, my plan, which depends on controlled management of all significant variables, has acquired an uncontrolled variable. He contacted Masa Meta.
I need the full surveillance output from the Senate district for the past 30 days. Everything, every system, regardless of how it was resolved, and I need it without routing through the intelligence directorate. Directly to me. Understood, it will be done.
Massa Meta, who had survived 20 years in Palpatine's service, primarily by being excellent at understanding when questions about the reasoning behind an instruction were inadvisable, acknowledged without questions. Palpatine began reviewing the surveillance output that evening. He was methodical in his review, which took 7 hours, and what he found was consistent with his preliminary analysis. A series of small anomalies, individually explainable, collectively forming the specific signature of something that knew where the surveillance was and was operating in its gaps. Professional, highly professional. Not clone intelligence operative professional, their training was considerable, but produced a specific tactical signature. Not Jedi professional. Jedi investigative methodology was excellent, but relied on the Force in ways that created its own distinctive pattern. Not Separatist operative professional. He knew every Separatist intelligence capability and had designed several of them himself through Dooku. Something else. He pulled the 3 surveillance frames that had captured the most proximate images and studied them carefully. Human. Male. Middle-aged. Moving through environments with the specific quality of someone for whom moving through environments without being seen was not a practiced skill, but an internalized one. The difference between someone performing stealth and someone who had become stealth across enough time that it no longer required performance. The equipment visible in 2 of the 3 frames was unusual, recognizably practical rather than technological, mechanical rather than electronic, in ways that were either anachronistic or represented design philosophy he wasn't familiar with. He pulled up every database he had access to, which was comprehensive. No matches. The man did not exist in any record he could find. Which was not impossible. There were parts of the galaxy where records were thin, but which in the specific context of this investigation was an additional data point. Someone who came from nowhere, operated outside every existing framework, and was invisible to the Force. His mind produced the next analytical step, with the specific clarity of a consciousness that had spent 50 years operating at the intersection of impossible and inevitable. If this individual was investigating the Senate district, there was a non-zero probability that their investigation was directed toward the same source that every significant investigation in this city eventually reached. Toward him. He needed to know more before he could act. Acting on insufficient information against an asset he couldn't see through the Force would be exactly the kind of rushed decision that he had survived 50 years by refusing to make. He would accelerate his non-Force intelligence operations. He would accelerate certain aspects of the primary plan, and he would wait with the specific predatory patience that had made him what he was for the thing he couldn't see to come to him. On the 23rd day, Ezio found the Sith holocron. Not through the Apple's information systems, through physical investigation of a storage facility in the Senate District's substructure that his surveillance of Palpatine's movements had identified as a location the Chancellor visited directly and without aid accompaniment, which in Ezio's experience was the specific behavioral pattern of someone handling something they did not want documented. The facility's security was excellent by the standards of this galaxy's technology. By the standards of the Assassin Brotherhood's training, which had been refined across generations of defeating security designed by intelligent and cautious people, it was surmountable. He surmounted it in 40 minutes. What he found inside was not the financial records or the political correspondence he'd been anticipating, the conventional evidence of corruption that built cases in the conventional sense. What he found were objects, artifacts, things that his Apple-enhanced perception registered as significant in ways that bypassed the usual analytical channels and arrived directly in his body as a physical sensation of importance. The holocron was the most significant of them. He studied it without touching it. A pyramidal object, dark in a way that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed it, radiating a quality that the Apple's probability mapping registered as the single most dangerous thing he had encountered in 3 weeks in this galaxy. He had not touched it. He had photographed it. He had cataloged the room's full contents with the systematic completeness that the mission required. And then He had sat in a corner of the facility for an hour and thought. He had found evidence of things he did not yet have framework to fully interpret. But he had found enough to know that what he was looking at was not merely political corruption. The probability field around the objects, around the room, around the specific geometry of this facility, and its relationship to everything else he'd mapped. It said something that his 3 weeks of investigation had not said before. Ancient. Whatever was operating through Palpatine was old in a way that political corruption was not old. Old in the way that the first civilization was old, that the pieces of Eden were old. The specific oldness of things that had been operating across timescales that made individual lives irrelevant. He left the facility as he'd entered it, undiscovered, undisturbed, the security systems confident that nothing had happened. He spent the next 18 hours cross-referencing what he'd found against everything in his model. The model recalibrated. This was not a corrupt politician using manufactured crisis to accumulate power. Those existed, and he had killed several of them, and the principle was sound, but the scope was wrong. What he was looking at was something that used a corrupt politician the way a corrupt politician used institutions, as a tool, a vehicle, a mechanism for achieving objectives that exceeded the tool's own comprehension. A Templar who was also being used. He had encountered this category before. The men at the visible apex of corrupt power who believed they were the ones pulling the strings, and who were, in fact, strings themselves, held by something they had chosen not to look at directly, because looking at it directly would have required them to acknowledge that their power was contingent. He needed to understand what Palpatine actually was before he decided how to act. He went looking for information in the one place in this city that maintained records of things the official system preferred not to acknowledge, the Jedi Temple's publicly accessible archive, which he had spent 2 weeks mapping the external access points of, and which the Apple's capabilities made accessible through a maintenance interface that the Temple's security had not specifically anticipated needing to protect. He did not access the restricted sections. He didn't need to. What the publicly accessible sections contained, for someone who knew what patterns to look for, was enough. The Sith. An ancient order. A philosophy of power. A tradition of hidden control, operating through the specific methodology of concealment within legitimacy. Not different in principle from what he'd spent his life fighting. Different only in the specific metaphysical framework it operated through. And at the center of the Sith tradition, the rule that defined its current form, two. Always two. One who holds power, one who craves it. He sat with this in the archive's maintenance corridor for a long time. A Sith Lord in the Republic's highest office. The manufactured war. The accumulation of emergency authority. The Jedi Order being exhausted across multiple fronts simultaneously. All of it serving not merely a corrupt politician's personal ambition, but a specific ancient tradition's specific ancient objective. He thought about what happened to galaxies after their rulers consolidated total control through manufactured crisis. He thought about what he'd seen in Italy. About the decades before he'd understood what the Templars actually were, about what the territories they'd controlled had looked like from the inside, the specific texture of a place where freedom had been systematically removed by people who called it order. He thought about the young man in the corridor, the one wound too tight around his grief, carrying something that the wrong person was already watching. He thought about Obi-Wan, the specific quality of institutional faith he'd seen in that man. Genuine, careful, aware of its own potential for error in ways that distinguished it from the naive faith of the uncritical. And he thought about his own tradition's most fundamental question. Was Palpatine's death the right action, or was it the action that felt right because it was specific and physical and within his capacity, in a situation where the actual solution was larger and more complicated than any single assassination could address? He had asked this question before, in Florence, in Rome, in Constantinople, in every city where a target had existed at the center of a system designed to survive any individual's removal. The answer he'd arrived at, across decades, was not comfortable. He chose to approach the answer empirically rather than philosophically. He watched Palpatine for 3 days. Not the records, not the surveillance, not the pattern analysis. Him, the man himself, moving through his days with the specific quality of someone who had been performing a role for so long that the performance had become identity, who had spent so many years being exactly what the role required that the question of what existed beneath the role had become theoretically interesting rather than practically answerable. The man was brilliant. Ezio acknowledged this the way he had acknowledged the brilliance of the best Templars he'd faced, fully, without minimizing it, because minimizing an opponent's capability was the specific error that got assassins killed. He was also, in the 3 days of watching, something else. Old. Not in years, though he was old in years. Old in the specific way that people became old when they had been operating in full capability for so long that the capability had become the thing rather than a quality of the thing. A sword that had been used so much it had forgotten what it was for. On the third evening, Ezio made his decision. He would go to Palpatine's private chambers. He would learn what he could in proximity. Let the apple's probability mapping operate in close range, which produced significantly more detailed information than long-distance observation. He would determine whether there was a scenario in which removal was correct and achievable, or whether what was required was something that an assassin's toolkit could not provide. And if removal was both correct and achievable, he would not hesitate. He had never hesitated. In every city, in every year of his life spent doing this work. He did not intend to start now. The infiltration of Palpatine's private chambers required 4 hours of preparation and 11 minutes of execution. Ezio had spent 3 weeks becoming a maintenance contractor, not performing the role, but inhabiting it, understanding the specific rhythms of the Senate District's maintenance infrastructure well enough that his presence in its arteries was not aberrant, but expected. The credential chip the Apple had generated had been refined across multiple iterations until it matched not just the technical specifications of a valid credential, but the specific wear patterns and handling marks of a chip that had been in regular use for the kind of duration the access level it represented typically required. The approach route had taken 6 days to map. Not because the route was complex, it was, objectively, a series of maintenance corridors, service lifts, and the specific gap between 2 structural support columns on the 47th floor that had existed since the building's original construction and that nobody had ever felt compelled to seal because the external face of the gap opened onto a surface only something with specific free climbing capability could navigate. Ezio had specific free climbing capability. The preparation time was about the security's rhythm, the specific rotation patterns, the timing gaps between patrol intervals, the points where the coverage overlapped and the points where it didn't. Security designed by intelligent people had these gaps because intelligent people understood that coverage without rest degraded into coverage without attention, and intelligent security designers built rest into their systems. Those rest points were where operations happened. He moved through the approach at 0247 Standard Time, when the night rotation was at its lowest effective attention and the day rotation was still hours from bringing its fresh alertness to the environment. The apple was quiet in his hand. Not dormant, the sustained resonance that had been masking his force presence since arrival was still active, still producing the specific effect that made him a gap in whatever field these beings used to sense the world around them, but quiet, in the way it was sometimes quiet when what was ahead required his full natural capacity rather than its augmentation. He accepted this, filed it under, pay attention to everything, and continued moving. The outer office was empty, not unexpectedly. Palpatine's personal security rotated through the outer areas on a pattern Ezio had mapped with sufficient precision to know he had a 4-minute window in which the space would be occupied only by the fixed surveillance systems, which the Apple's sustained operation was already managing through the interface it maintained with the building's technical infrastructure. 4 minutes was enough. He moved through the outer office with the specific practiced efficiency of motion that had been rehearsed enough times that the body performed it while the mind attended to the environment, registering anomalies, updating the probability map, noting the specific texture of a space that belonged to someone who had been living inside a performance for so long that even their private spaces bore its marks. The decor was chosen, not inhabited. The objects were positioned, not placed. Even the signs of personal use, the chair's specific wear pattern, the arrangement of items on the desk, had the quality of a stage set designed by someone who understood what authentic occupation looked like and had reproduced its visual grammar without the spontaneous disorder that actual living generated. This was a space that had been constructed to communicate something about its occupant. He had been in spaces like this before. In Rome, in the Castel Sant'Angelo, in the private quarters of men who had decided what they were and had arranged their environment to reflect the decision rather than allowing the environment to reflect them. He paused at the inner office door. The Apple's probability mapping was producing something it had not produced before, not warning exactly, but the specific sharpening of potential consequence that it manifested when what was about to happen had many and divergent possible outcomes. He stood with it for 3 seconds, letting the information organize itself into usable form. Palpatine was inside. Not asleep. Awake, in the specific quality of awake that people were at 0247 when they were not people who slept much. Present in the room on the other side of the door in the specific, fully alert way of someone who had been expecting something. Not him. Not exactly. But something. The probability field said, he knows something is coming. He doesn't know what. The not knowing is producing its own kind of readiness. Ezio had encountered this before too. Marks who had developed, through long practice in environments where threats were common, the specific ambient vigilance that registered incoming danger without identifying its source. The response was always the same: be faster than the vigilance, and be more specific than it, because generalized readiness was not the same as specific readiness for the actual approach. He opened the door. The room was lit. A single lamp, positioned to illuminate a chair and the small table beside it, leaving the room's periphery in relative shadow. Palpatine sat in the chair, with his hands folded in his lap, wearing a robe rather than his chancellery robes, looking at the door with the specific quality of someone who had been looking at the door before it opened, and was therefore unsurprised by its opening. He looked at Ezio. Ezio looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, which was the specific moment that Ezio had learned, across a lifetime of these moments, told you more about the other person than anything they said subsequently. What Palpatine's silence communicated was, he was thinking, not performing, actually thinking, updating his assessment of the situation in real time with the specific rapid intelligence of a mind that genuinely operated at a high level. His eyes moved across Ezio with the quality of reading rather than seeing, extracting information, processing it, generating new analytical categories on the fly. "You are not in the Force," Palpatine said. His voice was remarkable. Ezio had observed it from a distance at public addresses, but proximity revealed its full quality. The specific instrument of it, calibrated and controlled in ways that communicated competence and authority, and the particular warmth of someone who had learned exactly how warmth functioned rhetorically and deployed it accordingly. "No," Ezio said. "I have been searching for you for 3 days," Palpatine said. "Through every intelligence network available to this office." He paused. "I found very little." "I know," Ezio said. "Yet here you are," Palpatine said. "In my private office at 0247. Not threatening, not armed in any visible manner." His eyes moved to Ezio's wrists, where the hidden blades were. Seeing the mechanism without, Ezio noted, identifying its function. "Though I suspect armed regardless." He tilted his head slightly. "What are you?" "Someone who has been investigating you," Ezio said, "for 3 weeks." "And your conclusions?" Palpatine said, with the specific quality of asking a question whose answer he had already anticipated multiple versions of, and was curious which version he was receiving. "That you manufactured this war," Ezio said. "That you have been accumulating emergency authority through crises you created. That every institution in this republic is being used to dismantle itself and concentrate what it represents into a single point of control." He paused. "That the point of control is you." Palpatine regarded him for a moment. "You have done this before," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ezio said. "Investigated powerful men. identified them as architects of hidden control. He paused. And then, removed them, Ezio said. The word settled between them with its full weight. Palpatine looked at him with the specific quality of attention that Ezio had only seen in a few people across his lifetime. The attention of someone encountering something genuinely novel and was fully engaging with its novelty rather than mapping it onto an existing category. "You are not Force-sensitive," Palpatine said. "Yet you found me. You evaded the Jedi. You navigated the most heavily monitored city in the galaxy for 3 weeks without appearing in any record I can find." He paused. "How?" "That," Ezio said, "is not a question I'll answer." Palpatine considered him. "What you understand about this situation," he said, "is accurate as far as it goes. The war is shaped. The Republic's current political trajectory is not accidental." He paused. "What you understand incompletely is why." "I know why," Ezio said. "Power." "Order," Palpatine said, and his voice carried the specific quality of someone who had made this distinction many times and found it genuinely meaningful. The Republic has been failing for decades. Its institutions are corrupted beyond self-repair. Its decision-making paralyzed by the competing interests of 1,000 systems with incompatible priorities. Its capacity to respond to genuine existential threats inadequate to the scale of those threats. He leaned forward slightly. "What I am building is not power for its own sake. It is structure, decisive, capable, unified structure. You are controlling it," Ezio said. "Yes," Palpatine said. "Then it is not order," Ezio said. "It is your preference for how things should be, imposed on everyone else's right to determine that for themselves." He met the Chancellor's eyes steadily. "I have heard this argument before, from men who genuinely believed it. The argument does not become true because the person making it is intelligent, or because the problem they are solving is real." Palpatine studied him. "You have killed men who made this argument," he said. "Yes," Ezio said. "And the systems they controlled? What replaced them?" "Something less efficient," Ezio said, "and more free. I have concluded across a lifetime of this work that free and inefficient is preferable to controlled and effective. Even if the inefficient freedom costs lives," Palpatine said. "Control costs more," Ezio said. "Eventually. Always." Palpatine rose from the chair. He rose with the specific quality of a very old man whose body had been maintained through capabilities that exceeded ordinary physiology. There was something in the movement that communicated power held in reserve, deliberate restraint rather than limitation. He was, Ezio noted with the full attention he gave to physical assessment of targets, more dangerous than he appeared.
"You came here to kill me." "I came to determine whether killing you was correct. I haven't yet decided."
Something shifted in Palpatine's expression. Not what Ezio had expected. Not surprise at the admission. Not manipulation triggered by uncertainty. Something closer to genuine interest. "Explain that distinction," Palpatine said. "You are one man," Ezio said. "You can be removed. But the system you've built, the structures, the loyalties, the legal framework of emergency authority, those don't disappear when you do. They continue under whoever replaces you, potentially without whatever restraints your own judgment applies." He paused. "I have removed architects before, and watched the architecture continue without them. Sometimes the removal produces a better outcome. Sometimes it produces a worse one. And in this case," Palpatine said, "in this case, the architecture is almost complete," Ezio said. "The war is nearly over. The emergency powers are nearly sufficient. You are days from the final consolidation." He held Palpatine's gaze. "Removing you now, at this specific moment, may produce chaos worse than the control you're imposing." "Then you won't act," Palpatine said, and the specific quality of his voice communicated that he believed this was the conclusion. "I haven't decided," Ezio said again. He saw Palpatine's hands move. Not quickly, deliberately, the specific movement of someone who had decided that the conversation had reached the point where talking was less useful than something else. The hands moved in a gesture that was not physically significant, and that produced an effect entirely disconnected from its physical cause. Ezio was already moving. He had been watching Palpatine's probability field since the conversation began, and the probability field had been communicating a specific thing for the past 40 seconds. The possibility of sudden action was high and climbing. He had not been standing still in the specific sense that mattered. His body had been maintaining the particular coiled readiness that years of this work had made automatic, present in the conversation while remaining capable of instant transition to physical response. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, not toward Palpatine but lateral, removing himself from the direct line of whatever the hand gesture was producing. A crackling, brilliant energy that struck the door behind where he'd been standing and left a mark that communicated definitively that it had been intended to damage rather than warn. Palpatine turned, tracking him, and the expression on his face had shifted entirely. The performed warmth was gone. The rhetorical quality was gone. What remained was the specific unmasked quality of someone for whom all the performance was a layer applied over something that did not perform. Something old and cold and entirely certain of its own capacity. "Remarkable," Palpatine said, and his voice had changed quality, the warmth stripped away. What remained was something that communicated the specific aesthetic appreciation of a predator encountering effective prey. "You moved before I..." He stopped. "Before you saw it coming?" Ezio said, maintaining the lateral movement, keeping his distance variable. "Your warning system is the Force. I'm not in it." "No," Palpatine said, "you are not." He raised his hands again. Ezio threw the hidden blade. Not at Palpatine's center mass, not the kill shot. At his right hand, the specific target that disrupted the gesture's completion, without requiring Ezio to close to a range where the energy weapon could be deployed in the confined time he had available. The blade struck. Not clean. Palpatine's reflexes were extraordinary, faster than any unaugmented human Ezio had encountered, and he had enough warning through whatever mechanism the Force provided to turn his hand partially away from the throw's intended angle. The blade did not sever. It cut, a deep cut across the back of the hand that produced immediate blood and immediate disruption of the gathered energy that the gesture had been building. Palpatine made a sound that was not a scream, but was its composed equivalent. Ezio closed the distance in the 3-second window the disruption provided and had his second hidden blade at Palpatine's throat. He stopped. Not because the blade was insufficient, because he was standing close enough to see Palpatine's face with full clarity, and what he saw in it was not what he expected. Not fear, calculation. The specific focused expression of a mind that had shifted from one problem to another, that had absorbed the wound, absorbed the new positional reality, absorbed the presence of a blade at its throat, and was already thinking past this moment to what followed it. "You won't kill me," Palpatine said. His voice was steady despite the blood running across his hand. "You told me why. The architecture continues without me. The chaos of an unmanaged transition may exceed the control I impose." "I haven't decided," Ezio said, for the 3rd time. "Then decide," Palpatine said. "You have perhaps 15 seconds before my security arrives. 30, if they're slow." Ezio stood with the blade at Palpatine's throat, and the probability field doing the thing it sometimes did in the critical moment. Not showing him the future, but showing him the weight of each path's consequences, the specific distribution of outcomes that each choice produced. "Kill him now." The architecture continues. The emergency powers transfer to the Senate committee structure. 3 or 4 possible successors, all of whom have been shaped by what Palpatine built, and will likely continue building it. Some worse and less measured than he is. None of whom have the specific restraint that a man of his intelligence might apply even to something he has constructed for his own ends. Leave him wounded. The timeline disrupted. A man of this caliber and this ambition, working against a deadline he hadn't expected to have, will move faster and less carefully. The specific, careful manipulation he's been applying to whoever is at the center of his final consolidation will become more urgent, more pressured, and urgency applied to delicate manipulation produces different outcomes than patience does. He didn't know enough about what the final consolidation required to know whether disruption would improve or destroy it. He did know one thing: the young man in the corridor. The probability field that had been the loudest thing he'd read in 3 weeks. The specific quality of someone whose decision was the pivot point for everything that followed. He thought about what a wounded and desperate Palpatine would do with a target he'd been carefully nurturing. He thought about what a Palpatine who suddenly felt time pressing would do differently from what a Palpatine with all the time he needed had been doing. He made his choice. He stepped back, removed the blade from Palpatine's throat, maintained the distance that kept him outside effective arm's reach, and looked at the Chancellor of the Republic, the Sith Lord, the architect, the center of the architecture, with the specific quality of a man who has made a decision he knows he will spend years examining. "I am not going to kill you tonight," Ezio said. Palpatine looked at him with the specific quality of someone reassessing a probability they had already calculated and finding the recalculation producing unexpected results. "Why?" he said. "Because the man you have been manipulating," Ezio said, "is carrying something you've been using against him. If I remove you tonight, the weight stays, and he'll carry it until something else offers to lift it." He met Palpatine's eyes. "What I'm going to do instead is make sure he hears what I told him in the corridor before you finish what you're building." "You spoke with Skywalker," Palpatine said, and the quality of his voice had changed again, the calculation sharpening with the specific focus of a man updating his model. "Once," Ezio said. Briefly, he moved toward the room's periphery, toward the approach route he'd mapped. "I haven't decided whether tonight was the right moment to act. I reserve the right to decide differently at a future moment." "You'll find me more prepared," Palpatine said. "You said that before I was in the room," Ezio said. "Preparation that can't see what it's preparing for has limits." He was at the maintenance access point before the security arrived. In the corridor outside, he heard Palpatine's voice, still controlled, still composed, giving instructions in the specific tone of someone managing a crisis they had not anticipated and were already folding into their existing architecture. He moved through the maintenance shaft and listened to the probability field resolve around what had just happened. Disrupted, the perfect execution had acquired damage. Not terminal damage, not the kind that prevented the outcome, but the specific damage that urgency applied to careful plans produced. Palpatine would move faster now, would push harder, would apply pressure where he had been applying patience. Whether that was better or worse than what had been coming, Ezio genuinely did not know. He was on a transport out of the Senate district by 0400, moving through the lower city's pre-dawn logistics flow with the specific ease of someone who had been invisible for 3 weeks and remained invisible now. His hand, where Palpatine's energy strike had burned the air beside it, had a mark that would take weeks to fade. Close, closer than he preferred. He had retrieved the throne blade from the office floor before the security arrived. Always retrieve, always account for everything left in a space you've occupied. The apple was quiet. He sat in the transport's lower level and thought about a young man wound too tight around grief and a galaxy standing at the edge of something its own people couldn't fully see, and about the specific weight of decisions made in rooms that history would never record. He thought about whether he'd made the right choice. He didn't know. He had never known in the moment. That was the honest truth that his Brotherhood's philosophy acknowledged and that most people found unsatisfying. You made the best decision available to you with the information you had, and then you lived forward into the consequences, and the consequences told you whether you were right in ways that the decision's moment couldn't. The transport moved through Coruscant's pre-dawn lower city with its cargo of workers and supply crates and one man from another century who carried an artifact that had pulled him through the gap between realities to stand in a room where a Sith Lord's perfect plan had, for 3 minutes, felt something it hadn't felt in 50 years. Uncertain. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know whether the wound to Palpatine's hand and timeline would produce something better or something worse than what had been coming. He didn't know whether the words he'd said to Anakin Skywalker in a maintenance corridor would matter. or whether they would dissolve into the noise of a young man's overcrowded consciousness and leave no trace. He knew one thing: the Force was not all-seeing. He had walked through the most Force-sensitive city in the galaxy for 3 weeks and not been found by it. He had stood in the same room as its greatest living practitioner and looked that practitioner in the eye with a blade at his throat, and the Force had not prevented any of it. The Force was extraordinary. He had watched it do things in 3 weeks that had no analog in anything he'd seen in his own world. Move objects without contact, read emotions from a room away, provide knowledge that experience and intelligence couldn't produce. But it had limits. Limits it didn't know it had, because nothing had ever existed outside it long enough to demonstrate them. He had demonstrated them. Whether the demonstration mattered, whether the wound he'd left on the timeline was the right wound, or whether he'd simply made things worse in ways he couldn't see yet, that was the question he'd be carrying forward. The apple pulsed once in his hand. He looked down at it. The sustained resonance that had been masking his presence was shifting, changing quality, communicating something through sensation rather than information, in the specific way it communicated things that exceeded its capacity for information. Another vergence. Somewhere. He closed his hand around the artifact and felt the city move around him and thought about everything he didn't know and everything he'd done anyway. In a galaxy ruled by destiny, he had walked through destiny's warning system and it had not seen him. And in the private office of the man who believed he controlled that destiny, a wound had been left, small, specific, deeply placed, in the architecture of a plan that had been designed to be perfect. Perfect plans, in Ezio's experience, were the most fragile kind, because they had no tolerance for the things they hadn't accounted for, and they had not accounted for him.